It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation. My family has roots here, and my mother went to university here back in the 40s, but to do German, not anything as practical as engineering in that sense. So it's good to be here. I should say, by way of my own background, my first degree is physics and philosophy, which gives me a philosopher's delight of concepts and a physicist's contempt for social science, and you'll see that come through as I start to go on and talk about some of the work we're doing on new research paradigms. And I'm going to throw some new language in. I'm going to talk later about abductive reasoning and abductive research, and I'll explain that when I come to it. But that's going to be key to the work we're doing. Subsequent to that, I worked on the program to combat racism for a few years, which took me to Australian Aboriginal land rights, to Latin America, and a whole bunch of things. I'm now firmly of the belief that everybody should actually spend at least a year overseas in some difficult environment before they're 25, because that shook me up. When you see an activist shot in front of you in Darwin and the police won't do anything about it because he's only an Abbo, you start to realize the world isn't the comfortable place you grew up in. So that sort of background. Eventually I had to earn a living, moved into decision support systems in the early days of computers, and from there into business management, general management, and then into strategy and research. And for the last 15 years, I've effectively been in research in IBM, and for the last 7 years for myself. About 10 years ago, the group I ran decided that we wanted to start again from scratch on social science. We decided it was in a really bad place, torn between an acceptance or a rejection of a model of science, which itself was about 40 or 50 years out of date. Whether you call it critical realism against social constructivism or postmodernism against modernism, it was all based on trying to create this contrast between empirical proof and something which was other, sort of classic dichotomy. So what we did is we went back to natural science, particularly complex adaptive systems, cognitive science. I'm going to talk about both of those in the course of this lecture, but then also into some of the more sensible areas of social systems, anthropology, ethnography. Probably created the first ever distributed ethnographic system, and we'll talk about that later. So the idea was that every now and then you need to do a reset, which is why I've put that quote up there. For those of you who don't know, Cardinal Bellarmine was one of the most intelligent theologians of his day. This is at the time of the Reformation. He was one of the leading thinkers on the Counter-Reformation, and also the guy who had to deal with Galileo. And this is a famous letter he writes about Galileo to another supporter, Toscanini, which basically says, look, it's okay to say that the Earth goes around the sun for the purpose of mathematical calculation in universities, but it's obviously ridiculous to say it does it in practice. Now we look at it with the benefit of a few hundred years of hindsight, and we say how stupid. The reality is there are Cardinal Bellarmines in every university, government, and industry that we work in. What actually happens, this is a key part of what we know from cognitive science, basically entrained patterns of belief or ways of doing things persist long after their utility has been disproved. And you've only got to look at the history of science. Major scientific advance is always mavericks or accidents. It's very rarely progression from the existing field. So what I'm going to be talking about now is actually a paradigm shift. I want to start and explain that. I'm going to do some of the core science on this, create a model to show how management thinking has moved over the last 100 years, and then finish off with some of the new intervention and techniques. I should say now I'm going to make some strong distinctions between things. A huge amount of people confuse systems dynamics with complex adaptive systems theory, and it's not the same thing. So I'm going to exaggerate differences to make sure people don't make that confusion. So I reserve the right to be more reasonable under questioning, but more extreme in presentation. Right? That's the way it's going to work. So hold that quote in mind. First of all, let's get the complexity out of the way first. And I'm going to talk, some of you will know a lot about this. I'm told some people won't, so I'm going to do the basic introduction. What I want to do, and I'll define my terms first, I want to define a system as any network which has coherence. Now, the word coherence is going to be of increasing importance over the next few decades. It's come out of philosophy as an alternative to empirical proof or relativism. Ironically driven by the need to handle creationism in the USA. I still don't believe we have to take this nonsense seriously, but we do, right? So you can say that evolutionary theory is coherent to the facts, but creationism is incoherent to the facts. It doesn't require you to say that evolution is completely right, because it isn't. If you look at the recent discoveries on exaptation, for example, which engineers really need to pay attention to, that actually contradicts some of what Darwin said. But we know it's going in the right direction. Yeah? So the concept of coherence is also coming into government policy. You live in a highly uncertain world. How do you discover which interventions are coherent, even though you may not be able to fully predict what result they will bring? And so here, there's a whole mathematics of coherence. You can look at Fagard's work on this and the work we've done subsequently. I'll talk later about the work we're doing to produce coherence tests for policy, working on huge narrative databases. Yeah, so the concept of coherence, another word is coalescence rather than categories. Human beings love to put things into little boxes. Anybody done a Myers-Briggs psychological test at any stage? Okay, I've refused my entire life. Many corporates. I've said until somebody can show me some validation for it in natural science, I'm going to refuse it. For those of you who don't know, it was started by two researchers who read a book about Jung, not even a book by Jung, and produced a questionnaire, and it's since become a self-validating system. If you look at the controlled test, it works the same way that the gypsy works with a crystal ball in the fair. It suggests enough with a sufficient level of ambiguity that you fill in the gaps for yourself and then put yourself into a convenient little box. And of course, HR people love these types of systems because they want to treat people like widgets in a machine. Right? We're now starting to move away from categories because categories are dangerous. You don't see things on the borders, into thinking about effectively coalescence or coherence. So coalescence means I know I'm in the center of a gas cloud, but the boundaries become vague or fuzzy. Yeah, so you start to move away from rigid boundaries into these sort of different types of concepts. Yeah. So that's how I'm defining the system, what I'm going to talk about today. An agent is anything which acts within the system. I did at one point talk about actors, but that got me confused with actor network theory, which I don't want to be, so I've gone back to agent. It's important to realize that an agent in a social system can actually be an idea, not necessarily a person. In fact, ideas can be more important than people with agency in complex systems. Human beings are fundamentally dependent on metaphor. Our language evolved from metaphor. Some of the work I'm doing at the moment in battlefield conditions is to produce metaphor-based command languages. Because metaphors allow you to explain very complex ideas in very simple, highly structured ways, in ways we haven't really thought of before. But the point is the metaphor can become a dominant idea. People get sucked into them, they follow them, they want to carry on in that way. So an agent isn't just a person, it can be a group, or it can be an idea or a concept, and those differ in different areas. Just to shake you up a little bit, for those of you who don't know, culture can change the chemical structure of DNA within 2 generations. Right? So we're now starting to understand an awful lot more about the way physical reality is changed by social systems. Right? So there's an awful lot starting to come out at the moment. So that allows me to define 3 types of system. An ordered system is one where the level of constraint that the system imposes on agents is such that all agent behavior is predictable. And this is what people like to do when they misuse the engineering word in the context of organizations. Personally, I think the engineering community should sue Hammer and Chamfrey from talking about business process re-engineering, because actually an organization is not a machine. It can't be engineered in the sort of sense they meant it. Anybody come across Six Sigma yet? Yeah, I call it Six Stigma. Business process re-engineering with the worst aspects of Bible Belt fundamentalism added onto it for good measure. The high priests of the cult have different coloured belts to indicate their status as cult leaders. And if they get a black belt, they're exempt from ordinary duties, so they can impose discipline on ordinary members of the firm. 3M threw out Six Sigma because it was destroying their capacity to innovate. Something the consultants are not telling the NHS or government, because of course government always adopt things after industry as on the ground it's industrial best practice. If you didn't know it, it's taught in consultancy. When you can't sell it to industry anymore because they know it doesn't work, go and sell it to government as industrial best practice and you'll get another decade of life. The reality is that engineering approaches, in the management sense of the word, only apply to ordered systems. Only when you have a level of constraint which makes the system controllable and predictable can you actually apply techniques like business process re-engineering or Six Sigma? Right? Nothing wrong or right with this, but that type of system works.